Welcome back to FinCrime Agent. Today I have the great pleasure to host Dr. Mariola Marzouk. In this episode, she's a specialist in trade-based money laundering with a background in forensic accounting and compliance technologies. She co-founded Vortex Risk and has conducted groundbreaking research in trade-based money laundering detection space. Mariola also serves as a honorary lecturer at the University of Portsmouth and actively contributes to Coptic Orphans charitable work. So, welcome Mariola, how are you today?
Very good, thank you very much for having me.
It's my pleasure, and it's very good to host you today. I really look forward to our interview. In fact, if that's okay, I'd like to jump straight in. We recently had a chat about trade-based money laundering, and you mentioned that there is no such thing as TBML, which for me was a bit controversial, right? And maybe could you elaborate on this viewpoint and explain why you think the term is misleading?
Of course. So maybe let me ask you a question in this case, since I'm the challenger here about trade-based money laundering. What is trade-based money laundering and how do you know that?
Well, we know that trade-based money laundering, of course, is connected with the international activities of transferring money, right? That are aimed to do money laundering correlated to goods internationally. So this can be done through different type of techniques. And how do you know that? You, of course, will need to try to detect maybe through fake letter of credits or this type of activity. So that would be probably the general understanding of the activities behind trade-based money laundering. But you are the expert here.
Okay, so yeah, you hit few keywords in there. You said international, you said goods,
Yeah.
and then you said letters of credit.
For example.
Yes, and where did you get that information from? Meaning now is the answer on how do you know that? Where'd you get that from?
It's just general knowledge that is coming across when you learn about trade-based money laundering. Can be from different sources, maybe FATF and all the other organization that works in the prevention of money laundering.
Yeah, so you mentioned FATF over there, and indeed, they are the ones who actually positioned trade-based money laundering as what you have described. So trade-based money laundering before 2006, it did not exist. There was not such a term as trade-based money laundering. There was a lot of academic papers being produced by authors like Dr. Zdanovic, for example, that talked about exploitation of import and export for nefarious activities. And these nefarious activities obviously ranged in all sorts of predicate crimes. Before that, therefore, they were not calling it trade-based money laundering. Then in 2006, the FFTF comes up with this term. And I have a definition written here because I need to make sure that we, comply to the letter of the law. So let me just read that definition, and then you will be able to pick up where you got that, illicit, finance, international letters of credit. So trade-based money laundering is a process of disguising the proceeds of crime and moving value through the use of trade transactions in an attempt to legitimize their illicit origin. Further, they expand later on that it's through misrepresentation of price, quality, or quantity of imports and exports. In 2008, they drop in services are also included, but that's about a line or two in there. Then in 2021, they issued kind of aggregation of the red flags and risk indicators. And in there, they use even more flamboyant language by saying it is abusing international supply chains and abuse of professional money launderers and professional enablers. And it's by organized transnational criminals. Well, so I started researching trade-based money laundering, obviously from that starting point, right? This is the starting point. This is what I've been told trade-based money laundering is when I commenced my research. And throughout my studies, which lasted about 5 years, and I've interviewed about 27 actually more, because I've done a pilot study and then the main study. So about 40, actually, I've interviewed individuals to ask them about that particular definition and how do they experience trade-based money laundering? Meaning, how does this compare to what they are being told versus to what they need to work towards? And the individuals I've interviewed range from law enforcement and compliance professionals, obviously sitting in the very senior roles. Individuals that moved about the industry, naturally, you know that within compliance space, you work a little bit for the regulator, then you look for the consulting company, then you work for a bank, and then you work for a technology vendor, and round you go again. So they actually had quite rounded understanding of what trade-based money laundering is in practice. But let me take you back to this definition in 2006. When it was being issued, countries around the world rushed, naturally, to search through their data to understand whether actually they might be the prevalent facilitators of that trade-based money laundering definition, which is illicit activities by organized crime, moving values internationally and using goods and so forth. And when they had a look, they actually couldn't find that much of that particular trade-based money laundering situations happening. But you don't contradict FFTF. So they've decided it's probably because they need to understand a bit more about what the FFTF means. And actually, there was one country, Australia, that challenged and said, well, that definition doesn't really fit very well in what we are trying to achieve. We are searching, but we can't find. We find other things. So how about, dear FFTF, you expand the definition to include other activities that also involve trade and will help us, therefore, to design better legislative measures to counter this particular threat. Obviously, that hasn't been done. But countries had to comply with the FFTF rules, because if you don't, what happens to a particular country that is not really ticking the boxes? Well, it might face a problem trading internationally, particularly if you are a very large financial center like Singapore or Hong Kong or the United Kingdom. You better comply. Otherwise, you have to explain yourself, right? It might be not good for you. You might be gray listed, blacklisted, some sort of listed, and it will prevent you from growing your economy. So they complied. Well, that was interesting at that point, because then I started to question whether we got this definition right. So when I spoke to individuals and asked them about their perception, I started with banks, naturally, because they are the ones who are holding the heat of detecting these criminal activities, right? And they told me, well, we were surprised to learn about that particular definition. And when we searched, again, through our databases of criminal activities, we couldn't find much of it. So I asked, where did you search? Well, the only products that actually fit that definition is the one you pointed here. You said letters of credit. Well, letter of credit, documentary collection, guarantees. So the whole trade finance. Why trade finance? Because that's the product or a set of products that are used to facilitate international trade in large volumes of goods for import and export, right? And this is actually where you can detect misrepresentation of data. Because you can't in other ways. Like if I transfer you money for a payment for, let's say, a TV, I don't need to put anything in there. There's no data, or I can just manufacture invoices on my computer. There's a very little documentation needed. But with trade finance, there is loads. So I asked them about that particular documentation. What happens there? And they explained the whole process of reviewing a trade transaction. And it's extraordinarily detailed, I must say. Every transaction, they pointed, is reviewed by humans, scrutinizing it, not only for the red flags, but also to make sure that the bank is not going into a deal that is going to cost them, because in those particular situations, they take on the risk as well.
Sure.
And when they reviewed those, if there was a suspicious activity because of a red flag, they also explained that those red flags were very unhelpful in understanding if a client actually was doing something dodgy or not. So because they couldn't explain it, or because it was too expensive to explain, because it was too long to explain, since you would have to ask for a lot of additional documentation, they would simply file a suspicious activity report. It's called defensive reporting, right?
Yes.
And then I had a look at, so we're just going to point the last one, linking back to the academic dissertations or papers that are written. Academics actually were highlighting that there is a lot of activity on trade that involves no misrepresentation of data, or where those data anomalies in price or quantity are for legitimate reasons, because let's say there is an error in recording, or there is a difference in recording the price at import and export, because later on, let's say, insurance costs are added, because people are actually having contracts during, in these contracts, they decide, I'm going to give you a discount for this and that because you are my good client and so forth, that there are reasons for it. So, and then further, only international trade? How about the domestic one? Further, really only criminals are doing that? How about large corporate institutions using mispricing, misinvoicing in order to move their money from high tax jurisdictions to low tax jurisdictions? It is principle of arm's length accounting, and it's legal. So I'll stop there.
You started to talk about the detection element, and I want to go a bit deeper in there to understand from your experience the primary barriers or challenges that financial institutions face in detecting and preventing, if I can keep calling it, TBML. So
yes, of course. I know that it's going to be comfortable to call it. Otherwise, how else do we call it? I'll tell you how else we can call it. We can simply call it money laundering.
Right.
And then I'll get to that. I'll get to that. Right. So on the detection side, well, again, starting from the how do we know that trade-based money laundering is what it is? Well, we actually have no research. Trade-based money laundering or abuse of trade, as a matter of fact, money laundering in itself is the most under-researched subject in economic crimes. We don't research that. As a trade-based money laundering in particular doesn't return much insights when you actually conduct a literature review. So I had to do literature review in order to, as part of my dissertation. And I struggled to find information or papers that would be different to this definition or constantly permutating the same knowledge. There is very little. And then there was also a study conducted by a professor at Australian University that also reached the same conclusion. When she and her team reviewed all the literature, they realized we can't learn much. There's very little written. Okay, so if it's such a prevalent money laundering, the most prevalent money laundering method in the world, where trillions are being laundered, it's causing us such a big problem. How come there's so little on it written? How come there is no research on this? How, therefore, can we learn about detection if we don't understand what it is and how we should measure it? And therefore, what sort of mitigation principles we should put in place? You can't if you don't have the basic knowledge about it. That starts there.
I look forward to see actually and read the study that you have completed on that to expand my knowledge with the different angle that you're bringing forward. So if we instead move into the regulation and compliance, how do you see the current state of regulations around trade and financial crime? Do you think current regulations are effective? I kind of have a guess on that, but is there room for improvement?
Okay. So regulations, right? So there is regulations, and there is, of course, incentives to apply the regulations, and then there is the effectiveness of the regulations, and there are actors that are involved in what we would now term a policing of economic crimes, right? So let's move to the policing angle, right? So we have public institutions that are tasked with policing. We are talking mainly about the government executing the responsibility towards us all in making sure that crime does not pay, right? And they use police officers mostly to police the crime. Well, here is the problem as well. Well, police has been so underfunded for so many decades. They are constantly facing restructures. Their knowledge about money laundering or economic crimes is not that good, and they admit that. Further, their incentives to go after complex crimes or hiring individuals with subject matter expertise that are expensive does not seem to be like a good, return on investment for citizens. In the meantime, they also are responsible, accountable to the politicians to show that the crime is under control, because we don't want the public to think that actually our ability to police economic crimes is poor. So we need to show good statistics. If you have good statistics on crime detection, or whatever means, then you get paid, you secure budgets, your managers are happy, the politicians are happy. So if you are accountable for those statistics, are you going to go after complex matters like trade-based money laundering that is under research, misunderstood, difficult to detect, nobody knows actually what it is? You are not. You are going to go after a low-hanging fruit. However, when you speak at conferences, you will speak about trade-based money laundering using those definitions because it's a very popular subject. But you are not going to be detecting it. How do I know that? Because they told me that. They described, for example, the pattern that we use for detecting trade-based money laundering. Let's think about how those red flags came about, right? The red flags actually came about in 2010 when Vincent was asked to review trade transactions between the United States and some Latin American countries. And they came up with red flags of what could potentially be trade-related illicit activity. And if you look at those flags from that time, everything under the sun could fall into that category. Actually, yeah, they were right. It's a money laundering. Gradually, those started to be a little bit more narrow because everything would be included. Now, how those more narrow flags came about? Well, the FFTF decided these particular red flags that they want financial intelligence units that are part of their network to be reporting cases on. So those FIUs searched their database about those red flags. Oh, yep, here it is. That's trade-based money laundering, and file them to FFTF. Now, where do those FIUs get those cases from? Banks are mostly the ones who are filing those suspicious activity reports, right? Okay, so somewhere they must have marked there was trade-based money laundering, or maybe it pertained to trade finance, because immediately that means trade-based money laundering. Now, when I ask banks, how do you know that this is trade-based money laundering? Well, there are only two. The red flag hit. I wasn't sure, or the law enforcement told me that this could be trade-based money laundering. So then I asked the law enforcement, how do you know? Well, I don't know. We don't investigate these things. We don't have time for that. Well, if that's the case, if we go all the way down the chain and we know, why don't they know? Because there's no knowledge about it, because we didn't research it well. So how come FFTF claims that this is trade-based money laundering if all the way to the bottom, there is no knowledge and the research? Law enforcement is confused what that is. They actually don't prioritize trade-based money laundering. They prioritize other crimes. The banks rely on the law enforcement to tell them, to help them. Other things they have is just their suspicion, because it hits the flag or not. So that seems like a very poor source of information for our understanding of trade-based money laundering. So how can you detect it then with accuracy? It's just not going to work.
I'm wondering if technology is going to play a role in here, because as all my podcasts and interviews, I need to put in there a question about technology being being me, So how is the technology, of course, including AI and machine learning, influencing how the financial institutions that are regulated needs to detect and mitigate the trade-based money laundering risk? Are there any promising developments that you have seen on the horizon without naming specific organizations?
So my entire PhD was about technology, right? I did it like because a product manager. That's basically how I took the angle of conducting the research. Yeah, the findings were very disappointing, but I understood why. It's not because technologies are bad. It's because people who are behind those technologies do not understand the problem. Why don't they understand the problem? Because they are misinformed. Why are they misinformed? Because we have not conducted a thorough research on what trade-based money laundering is and how financial institutions experience trade-based money laundering. Further, how does criminal think about trade-based money laundering? Because ultimately we are trying to stop criminals, right? What do they think about trade-based money laundering? Well, of course, we can't interview them because they won't tell us. And even the interviews that we have done, we have interviewed people who are imprisoned. Well, if they are imprisoned, obviously they were not very good money launderers because clearly we are not good at detecting them. Since we constantly quote the same statistics, only 1% is detected, right? So interviewing those who got caught, they are not very good sourcing information. So what else we can do? Well, I've decided with my partner to be just that and just feel free. Since I am no longer in a compliance space, who is there to stop me to brainstorm how I would launder money? No one. I can just brainstorm. So I decided to take the persona of a criminal with Dr. Gilmer. And Dr. Gilmer actually conducted a lot of research on that perspective. He was in the law enforcement, so he can speak to it much better. But if you consider a criminal, if you ask them, do you use trade-based money laundering? Their response would be most certainly, what is that? What's trade-based money laundering? I don't know that. All I do, I just launder money. I distance myself from my illicit proceeds so that they are not taken away. And they are not confined to the typologies that are being bucketed for us for the simple-minded by FFTF. They use the whole, buffet, as Dr. Gilmour likes to say, of choices they have. Okay, if they use the buffet and we work in the silos, no wonder we are not getting anyone caught. And when I asked, obviously, participants in my studies, what do you think about those technologies? Well, they just find more or less the same stuff, just faster and cheaper. What do they find? Well, they find, and I'm just going to use the word they've used, where they find idiots. Stupid money launderers. They have much better results, they've highlighted, from having an experienced human using critical thinking and knowledge about trade and the market that parties trade in to detect something that is suspicious. So I'll give you some examples that that I found quite interesting. One of them is a participant was telling me that there was a trade that seemed absolutely perfect on paper. And it should have gone through, but it was stopped by a professional. Technology wouldn't detect it, by a professional. Upon holding a paper, smelled it and said, well, that should smell like a stale meat because from a meat trader. Well, they handle meat, they handle papers. Those papers should be dirty, they should smell. But this one was crispy clean. And he found that suspicious. And it was suspicious enough that they started to investigate. And indeed, that was a fraudulent transaction. Another one, a trade is executed and leather goods are being shipped in a container. Should be fine, technology wouldn't spot everything. And all the documentation is fine. But what the human, thinking critically, observed is, well, but the container they are using is slightly higher than normally you would use for this particular goods. Those containers are more expensive and that particular leather goods are not that of that value. So that is a bit strange that they should use that height of a container. and they investigated, and indeed, that was a fraudulent transaction. And I say fraudulent because that's most of the time what happens. They claimed that most of the suspicious activities on trade finance was fraud or capital flight, or just hitting policies that the bank set up. For example, do not trade with Pakistan or facilitate transactions with any human that has Afghanistan attached to them, which is called, by the way, de-risking. This is not ethical, but that's what it is. Or currency exchange restrictions, not actually money laundering on trade finance. But back to our beginning of our conversation, you said letters of credit. You said trade finance. You said international transactions. You said goods. And as a criminal, I will avoid all of that. I will use domestic trade. I will use services. I'll make sure that even if my volume of criminal activity goes that high, where domestic trade might be, a burdensome for me, and I might need to, do some international. No, I'm just going to set up more domestic businesses. I'm going to avoid that because I know that banks have technology in place to monitor those transactions for international transactions. I'm just going to avoid that. Oh, and definitely, I'm not going to do any misrepresentation of data for technology to spot. They know how this system runs. They don't hit the red flags. Most of the legitimate customers hit the red flags. We know that because in a technology space, we still quote 99, 95, 90% is false positives. Yes, because those red flags, as my participants said, are useless and add no value into spotting criminality, but they tick the regulatory boxes.
So, enriching today this discussion on trade-based money laundering, I'm going to still call it that just for everybody's understanding, but it's extremely interesting what you've been saying today. I want to have one more question, which is forward-looking. If we look at the future, where do you see the future of financial crime compliance heading in the next 5 or 10 years? Of course, it's very hard to predict such a long time, but just to get your opinion on that would be interesting.
Okay, well, I'm a challenger, and I'll tell you, it's not hard. It's a very easy prediction, and it is the following word: nowhere. We are not going to go anywhere. We're going to stay where we are, where we were 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, today, and into the future. Just look at the conversations we are having on LinkedIn and in those conferences where summary notes of everyone is, we need to collaborate. We need to do better private-public partnership. Well, actually, the regulatory regime that is set up is not facilitating that, by the way. We need to get better at spotting criminal actors. But are they the ones that are laundering the biggest amount of money? Or perhaps the large corporations that are transferring a lot of money from low tax jurisdiction, high tax jurisdiction to low tax jurisdiction? How about we tackle tax evasion / avoidance? Who knows, because the line is so blurry that we struggle actually to decide. How come we have so many extraordinarily rich companies that are running our societies? Is really the criminals such a big problem? Well, actually, most of them, if you read the research papers by many, well, most of them, actually, most criminals don't make enough money to need laundering, by the way. They need to spend on their, normal activities of life. And if they do even have enough funds to launder, most certainly they will first apply some sort of self-laundering techniques before they get so large that they need to use a professional enabler, which is a bad term. These are still money launderers if they facilitate that. And if someone is committing a fraud offense, well, they know very well how the system works. They're probably not going to need professional enabler. So, where it's going? Nowhere. we are still going to be talking about the same thing in 10 years from now. Simple.
I hope there will be a change, and I have a bit of a more positive view on that. I'm more hopeful, let's say. But I appreciate your inputs and very much appreciate your time today. It was super interesting to talk to you. And if people wants to get in touch with you, what is the best way to reach you, Mariola?
Oh, please link me. I love LinkedIn. I think this is a very nice platform to interact. Well, particularly that most traveling is quite expensive. Yeah, you can visit Vortex Risk page, and there are emails there. You can just get in contact with us if you have any questions.
Brilliant. I will leave your contacts and the URL for your company, of course, in the description of this video. So thank you one more time. I'm gonna close this video as usual. And if you have enjoyed this interaction with Mariola and all the videos on my channel, please remember to subscribe to my channel. And if you press the like button, you will greatly support the expansion of this video and the work that I do for this channel. If you want to actively contribute, there is a Patreon link in the video description, or you can just send a super thanks directly on this YouTube video. So that's all for today. One more time, thank you for your time, Mariola, and until next time, see you soon.
Thank you.